It was the last week of October, 1988. Marlow, Indiana was a quiet town of 4,000 people, built around a limestone high school with a clock in the auditorium that a man named Emmett Rusk kept running by hand. One Friday night, he locked the building, hung his keys on the board, and walked out into the cold. He never came back. There was no search, no dogs, no detectives, no press conference, no flyer stapled to a telephone pole, because nobody ever reported him missing. For 27 years, the town believed Emmett Rusk had simply moved away. Then, in 2015, a woman emptying a condemned building opened a staff locker nobody had touched since the Reagan administration. Inside were 2 pairs of work boots in 2 different sizes. And one small detail hidden underneath them led to a truth no one was prepared for. If stories like this one matter to you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going, and it costs you nothing. Now, let's get into today's case. Marlow Consolidated High School was built in 1927 out of Indiana limestone, 3 stories tall, with a bell tower that hadn't held a bell since 1961, and a boiler the size of a locomotive. By the spring of 2015, it was dying. The district had voted to consolidate. A new campus was going up 11 miles east, all glass and steel and geothermal heating. And the old building on Cutler Street had been given a demolition date, May of 2016. Between now and then, everything inside it had to come out. Every desk, every trophy, every filing cabinet, in every closet, in every forgotten corner of a building that had been swallowing objects for 88 years. The district assigned that job to Ruth Ann Doss. She was 62 years old. She had worked in that building since February of 1989. Ruth Ann was a small woman with a gray braid she wound up under a ball cap, forearms like a farmhand, and reading glasses she wore in a shoelace because she'd lost 11 pairs and refused to lose a 12th. She drank her coffee out of a thermos cup that had been black once and was now a soft, chalky gray. She had raised 2 kids in a rented house on Dell Street, buried a husband in 2004, and cleaned the same 140 rooms for 27 years. She knew that building the way you know a body. She knew which radiator in the West Hall knocked when the pressure came up. She knew the 2nd floor drinking fountain ran warm for 40 seconds before it ran cold. She knew that if you leaned on the auditorium stage door at exactly the right angle, it would open without a key. And she had never told a single administrator, because it was the only way to get a floor buffer in there without going the long way around. She had a system for the decommissioning. 3rd floor first, then 2nd, then 1st, then the basement. Room by room. Nothing skipped. You go room by room, she told the 2 temp workers the district sent her in March, both of them 19 and neither of them interested. You don't grab what's easy and leave the rest. You do the room, then you do the next room. They lasted 6 weeks. After that, it was mostly her. She didn't mind. She'd been in that building alone more nights than she'd been home. What she minded was the way it emptied. A room stripped of everything doesn't look clean. It looks skinned. She'd finish a classroom, stand in the doorway with the lights off and the tape gun still in her hand, and feel something she couldn't name pressing on her chest. She got through the 3rd floor by June. Here is a thing that happens in old buildings and almost nowhere else. A person can leave, and their handwriting can stay. Ruth Ann had worked her entire career surrounded by the handwriting of a man she had never met. His name was on the maintenance tags, small block capitals pressed hard enough to emboss the cardboard, always in the same order: the date, the fixture, the fix. August 14th, 84/A. UD clock / new escapement spring, cut from stock, will not last. 3-2-86/Girls Locker RM/Trap Repacked. Do not use plumber. He over tightens. November 9th, 87/Boiler S. Feed/bleeder seized. Free it monthly or you will be sorry. He signed nothing. He didn't need to. Everybody who ever worked in that building knew that handwriting the way you know a voice through a wall. E. Rusk, Night Custodian. Marlowe Consolidated, 1971 to 1988. Ruth Ann had inherited his tools. A ball-peen hammer with a handle wrapped in friction tape gone stiff and shiny. A pipe wrench so old the jaw had been recut by hand. A Folgers can full of washers, sorted by size, with a strip of masking tape on the outside of the can that said washers in those same block capitals, as if the can might somehow forget. She had used those tools almost every working day of her adult life. And in 27 years, she had learned exactly 4 things about the man himself. All of them from people who were now dead. He was 41 when he left. He had come to Marlowe in 1971 from somewhere down south, took the night shift, and never took another. He lived in a rented room above Ketchell's Hardware on Front Street, up a staircase on the outside of the building, and he paid his rent in cash on the first of the month in an envelope, folded twice. He fixed things nobody asked him to fix. That was the 4th thing, and the one people remembered. Mrs. Ivers, who taught choir until 1993, told Ruth Ann that Emmett Rusk had rebuilt the pedal action on the auditorium piano over 3 winters, a few hours a night, and had never once mentioned it to anybody. She only found out because she came back for a scarf at 10 o'clock and found him sitting inside the instrument with a penlight in his teeth. He apologized, Mrs. Ivers said. Can you feature that? He apologized to me for fixing my piano. He gave kids rides home in the rain in a green Chevy pickup with a bad clutch. He kept a coffee can of quarters by the payphone in the front hall so that any kid who needed to call home could. He knew the name of every student in a building of 600 and used it maybe twice a year. He had no family in Marlowe. No wife, no children, no brothers who came at Christmas. Nobody ever came for Emmett Rusk. He came for himself every night at 3, and he let himself in with his own key. And he did the work. That was the whole of it. That was everything the town had. And in the fall of 1988, he stopped coming. Ruth Ann Dost did not think about Emmett Rusk very often. For most of 27 years, he had been a set of habits she'd absorbed and a handwriting she read without noticing, the way you don't notice the font of a book. But there had always been a thing about him that itched. It was the tools. Because here is what a person does when they move away. They pack. They take what's theirs. And a man who wraps a hammer handle in friction tape and sorts his washers by size and writes washers on the can, that is not a man who walks off and leaves his tools behind. Ruth Ann had thought about it, off and on, for decades. She'd land on it in the middle of a shift, in some dead hour with the buffer humming. And she'd think, he left the wrench. And then she'd think, people do all kinds of things. He probably got somewhere and couldn't come back for a box of hand tools. Or he got a job that came with tools. Or he was sick of them. Or he was sick of Marlowe and everything in it, and the wrench was part of everything in it. There were 100 explanations, and she cycled through all of them. And every one of them fit, and none of them sat right. Something felt wrong, really wrong. It just did. The other thing, the thing she didn't think about at all until later, was the story itself. The story was that Emmett Rusk had gone down to Kentucky to look after his mother, and then he'd stayed. Ruth Ann had heard that story from Lyle Prather her very first week on the job. standing in the boiler room in February 1989 with her new keys in her hand and her new name on a new punch card. Lyle was the day custodian. Big man, 60 then, no, 58, she corrected herself later, when it mattered, with a gut and a gray flat top and forearms full of faded tattoos from the Navy. He talked constantly. He was kind to her in the specific way of a man who is glad to no longer be the newest person in a building. "You're taking days," he told her. "I'm going nights." "Why nights?" she'd asked. "Covering for Rusk," Lyle said. "He went down to Kentucky. Mother's poorly. He'll be back." Ruth Ann had accepted that completely. Why wouldn't she? She was 35 years old and she needed the job. It took her 27 years to notice the two things wrong with that sentence. The first was that Lyle Prather, a man who talked constantly, never mentioned Emmett Rusk again. Not once. Not in 8 years of working the same building on opposite shifts, passing each other every afternoon at 3, trading the same 9 jokes. And the second was this. Emmett Rusk came to Marlowe in 1971. He never took a vacation. He never took a sick day that anybody could remember. He never once, in 17 years, went to Kentucky. So how did anybody in that building know his mother was down there? It didn't make sense. It just didn't. But Ruth Ann Doss didn't ask that question in 1989. She asked it in 2015, standing in a corridor full of dust, holding a pair of boots that weren't the right size. Later, much later, once there was a file, and people whose job it was to reconstruct things, investigators put together the last confirmed hours of Emmett Rusk's life. There isn't much. That's the point of this story. Friday, October 21st, 1988, was cold and clear. There'd been a hard frost that morning that killed everything left in the gardens on Dell Street, and by afternoon the sky had gone that scoured, painful blue you only get in late October. Marlowe Consolidated played a home football game that night against Vernon Hill. They lost 27-6. The concession stand ran out of hot chocolate at halftime. Emmett Rusk worked the game. Several people remembered him there. In the way you remember furniture, he was on the track behind the visitors' bleachers with a rolling barrel. And at some point, he fixed the latch on the ticket booth, because there is a maintenance tag dated October 21st, 88 that says TKT booth/latch shimmed. Needs new strike plate. Order 1. Nobody ever ordered one. The strike plate on that ticket booth was still shimmed when the building came down. After the game, he did what he always did. He swept the bleacher aisles, killed the field lights from the panel under the press box, walked the building, checked the boiler, and locked up. At 11:40 p.m., he hung his keyring on the board in the custodial office, which is where it stayed. And then, at some point that night or early the next morning, Emmett Rusk got into a green 1979 Chevy pickup and drove south out of Marlowe on State Road 9. Why? That took 27 years to answer too. And the answer, when it came, was almost unbearably small. He was going to look at a truck. There was a man in Warwick County, 60 miles south, selling a 1972 Ford F250 with a rebuilt engine for $425. The ad ran in a regional trader paper the second week of October 1988. Emmett Rusk had circled it in pen. That circled ad was still in his room above Ketchell's Hardware when the landlord cleared it out the following spring. And the landlord threw it away along with everything else, because nobody came for any of it, and he needed the room. That's it? That's the whole reason. A 41-year-old man with a bad clutch drove south on a Saturday morning to look at a better truck. He never got there. Now, here is the part of a missing person story where the detectives come in. The K-9 units, the grid search, The volunteer line walking a soybean field shoulder to shoulder. The mother on the courthouse steps with a photograph. None of that happened. There was no investigation, because there was no missing person, because no one ever filed a report. Think about what that actually requires. Think about how much has to line up. Emmett Rusk had no wife to notice the bed, no children to call, no parents left alive. His mother had died in 1974 in Alabama, not Kentucky. A fact that took one afternoon and one phone call to establish in 2015, and that nobody in Marlow bothered to check for 27 years. He had no bank. He was paid by paper check, picked up in person at the district office, cashed at Marlow's Savings on the corner. He had no lease. He had a room and an envelope of cash. He had no telephone. There was a payphone at the bottom of the outside stairs at Ketchell's, and that was the number people had for him. And it was not really his number at all. He had a landlord who noticed the rent stopped in November, waited 2 months out of a decent man's patience, then boxed his things and put them in the alley, and rented the room to a young couple in February. He had a job. And the job was the one thing in the world positioned to notice. The job noticed for exactly 1 week. On Monday, October 24th, 1988, the building opened without a night custodian having been there. The floors weren't done. The trash from the game was still in barrels on the track. The principal, a man named Harold Beek, who has since died, asked Lyle Prather where Rusk was. And Lyle Prather said, "He called me. He's got to go down to Kentucky. Mother's poorly." That is the entire origin of the story that held for 27 years. One sentence, spoken by one man, in a hallway, on a Monday morning. Beek said fine. Beek said tell him we'll hold the shift. And Lyle Prather worked it. He worked it that week, and the next week, and the week after that. He worked days and nights both through the fall of 1988 and into the winter. And when the district finally hired a day custodian in February 1989, a 35-year-old woman named Ruth Ann Doss Lyle moved to nights permanently and kept working the night shift under Emmett Rusk's employee number. For 9 years, the paychecks went out under Emmett Rusk's name and Emmett Rusk's number, and Lyle Prather picked them up at the district office and signed them E. Rusk in a careful, slow, unpracticed hand, and cashed them at Marlow's Savings, where the teller knew him and never once looked at the front of the check. Nobody audited it. Why would anybody audit it? The position was filled. The work was done. The floors were clean. The boiler ran. The invoices balanced. The job was still being performed. And because the job was still being performed, no hole ever opened where a man used to be. That is the mechanism of this entire case, and it is worth saying plainly, because it is not a conspiracy, and it is not a cover-up, and it is stranger and colder than either of those. Emmett Rusk did not vanish without a trace. He vanished without a gap. 60 miles south, something else was happening. And for 27 years, these two things never touched. On March 19th, 1989, a county drainage crew clearing a culvert off a gravel pull-off on State Road 9 in Warwick County found human remains. An adult male, somewhere between 35 and 50, 5'9", give or take. He had been there through the winter. The pathologist found blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, at least 3 impacts, delivered with something heavy and probably not designed as a weapon. Manner of death? Homicide. No question about it, no ambiguity, nothing to argue. He had no wallet, no identification, No watch, no ring, no keys. Nothing in the pockets but a paper matchbook gone to pulp and 11 cents. He was wearing work clothes, dark green twill pants and a jacket to match, and a pair of boots. The case went to a young sheriff's investigator named Roland Pike. Pike was 29 that spring, 5 months into the detective bureau, and he did everything right. That's the thing about this case that ate him for the rest of his career. He did not fumble it. He worked it correctly, and it still went nowhere. He canvassed every gas station, tavern, and diner on a 40-mile stretch of Route 9. He got dental impressions and circulated them to 9 surrounding counties. He entered the case into the state's unidentified person system. He ran the description against every open missing persons report in Indiana and Kentucky, and got 17 possibles and eliminated all 17. And in June of 1989, he got a suspect. His name was Dwayne Stiles, 24 years old, out of Owensboro. A long sheet of thefts and 1 assault. In May of 1989, a state trooper stopped Stiles outside Boonville, driving a green 1979 Chevrolet pickup with a filed VIN plate and a set of plates that came off a junked Buick. Pike drove down and sat with him for 6 hours. Stiles admitted the truck was stolen. He said he bought it off a man in a bar for $200 and hadn't asked questions. He would not budge off that, not in 6 hours, not in 2 follow-up interviews, not ever. Pike had a stolen truck. He had a beaten man in a culvert 9 miles from where the truck was first seen. He had a suspect with a record and no alibi. What he did not have was a victim. He could not prove the truck belonged to the dead man because he did not know who the dead man was. He could not build a timeline because he had no starting point. He could not put a name on a warrant. Dwayne Stiles pleaded to receiving stolen property and auto theft, served 19 months, and walked out into the rest of his life. And the body, the man with no name, was buried in October 1989 in the county cemetery on Ridge Road, in a section reserved for the unclaimed, under a flat concrete marker 4 inches by 8, stamped with a number, 89-114. The case quickly went cold, but it never fully closed because Roland Pike would not let it. He kept the file. When he made sergeant, he kept it. When the Bureau reorganized in 1996, he kept it. When they went to digital records in 2002, he printed the whole thing and kept a paper copy in his own drawer because he did not trust a server with the only man he had ever failed. He retired in 2011. He took a photocopy home. He used to say the same thing to every new detective who came through. And he said it flatly, without drama, like a man reading a gas meter. I've got a whole homicide sitting ready to go. Suspect, evidence, everything. It's been ready for 20 years. All it needs is a name. 27 years passed. Say that sentence out loud, and then think about what it actually contains. The Berlin Wall came down. Marlowe's savings was bought by a regional bank and then by a bigger one. Ketchell's Hardware closed in 1997 and became a tanning salon, and then a vape shop, and then nothing at all. And the outside staircase where a man used to take a phone call rusted through and was cut off with a torch. Lyle Prather retired from Marlowe Consolidated in 1997, when the district finally consolidated the 2 custodial positions into one and the Nightline disappeared off the payroll. He drew Social Security under his own name and a small pension under a name that was not his, and nobody ever noticed, because nobody was ever looking. Because there was nothing to look at. Ruth Ann Doss cleaned that building. Her son Marcus graduated from it in 1996 and her daughter Bree in 1999. She watched her own kids walk across a stage she'd mopped that morning. Her husband, Ray, died in 2004. An aneurysm at a kitchen table in the middle of a sentence about a lawnmower. She took 4 days off and came back. The auditorium clock ran the whole time. Emmett Rusk's hand-cut escapement spring, the one his tag said, "will not last," lasted 40 years. Ruth Ann oiled it twice a year off a stepladder because his tag also said to. And every so often, in some empty hour, she'd pick up the pipe wrench with a recut jaw and think, he left the wrench. That was all. That was the entirety of Emmett Rusk's remaining presence in the world. One woman, in one building, occasionally noticing a wrench. There is no parent who died of a broken heart in this story. There is no sister who kept a bedroom untouched for 3 decades. No candlelight vigil, no anniversary segment on the 6 o'clock news. That absence is the wound. Everything else in this case follows from it. On July 9th, 2015, Ruth Ann Doss got to the basement. She'd done the 3rd floor, the 2nd, the 1st. She'd emptied 91 classrooms, the library, 3 labs, the band room, 2 locker rooms, the concession shed, the trophy cases, and a storage attic above the auditorium that had a 1953 wrestling mat in it and 11 wasp nests. The basement was last, and the boiler corridor was last within the basement because that was her own territory, and she was saving it, the way you save the room you loved. The custodial staff lockers were on the south wall of that corridor. 6 of them, steel in a row, painted institutional green over institutional tan over institutional gray. The layers chipped down at the edges like a geological cut. They had been there longer than she had. 4 of them she used, 1 for her own things, 3 for supplies. 1 had a jammed door and had been full of dead fluorescent tubes since the 90s. And 1 was Locker 14. Locker 14 was at the far end, in the corner where the corridor turned, and it had a padlock on it. Not a district padlock. A personal one, a master lock, brass gone green, the shackle furred with corrosion. Ruth Ann had known about that locker for 27 years. In her first week, Lyle Prather had said, "That one's Rusk's. Leave it. He'll want his things." And she had left it. For 27 years, without ever once making a decision about it. It was simply a fact of the corridor, like the knocking radiator, like the fountain that ran warm for 40 seconds. But you cannot demolish a building with a locked locker in it. She got the bolt cutters from the shop. She was not expecting anything. She wants that understood. She has said it in every interview since. She was expecting a jacket and a thermos, and maybe a girly calendar from 1988. And she had a contractor bag in her left hand, ready for all of it. The shackle went with a crack that came back off the tile twice. The door was swollen, and she had to put her heel against the frame and pull. Inside, hanging from the hook, was a dark green twill work jacket. On the shelf, a thermos, and a cardboard box of shop rags, and a Prince Albert tobacco tin. And on the floor of the locker, side by side, neatly, were 2 pairs of work boots. Ruth Ann crouched down and looked at them for a long time. They were both brown leather, both district issue, both worn to hell. But one pair was noticeably bigger than the other. Not a little bigger, 2, maybe 3 sizes. She picked up the smaller pair and turned them over, size 10.5, worn through on the outer edge of the right heel, right where a man rolls his foot if he walks all night on hard floors and favors that side. She picked up the bigger pair, size 12, worn through on the outer edge of the right heel, in exactly the same place, in exactly the same shape. 2 different men, 2 different feet. The same route, walked for years, until the leather gave out in the same spot. And Ruth Ann Doss, kneeling on a basement floor with a pair of dead men's boots in her hands, felt her blood run cold. Because Lyle Prather wore a 12. She had bought him a pair of ice cleats for Christmas in 1993. And she had bought a 12, and he'd made a joke about it, about boats. Emmett Rusk's locker had Emmett Rusk's boots in it. And it also had Lyle Prather's. She sat down on the floor of the corridor with her back against locker 13 and went through that locker properly, item by item, the way she did rooms. There was a lot in there. That was the first strange thing. It wasn't a locker that had been abandoned. It was a locker that had been used. 2 thermoses, one old and dented, one newer, a 1980s plaid pattern. 2 jackets, she'd missed the second one, folded on the shelf under the rag box. A 40 regular and a 46. 2 punch cards in the tin. And here she stopped breathing for a second, because the punch cards were the district's old mechanical kind, and one of them had a date stamp on it from 1994. 1994. 6 years after Emmett Rusk supposedly went to Kentucky, somebody had been clocking in and putting the card in his locker. There was a pair of reading glasses with one arm repaired with solder, not tape, because of course he'd solder it. There was a church key. There was a paper bag of hard candy fused into a single amber brick. There was a spiral notebook, water-swollen, containing nothing but boiler pressure readings in block capitals, ending on October 21st, 88. And underneath everything, flat on the bottom of the locker under a sheet of newspaper someone had cut to size, was a manila envelope, soft as cloth. Inside it were 4 things. A union apprenticeship card, Local 1113, issued to Emmett J. Rusk, 1969. A stationary engineer's license, low pressure, state of Indiana, renewed through 1989. A savings passbook from a bank in Alabama, last entry 1970, balance $312.40, and a fingerprint card. It was a state of Indiana civil applicant card, dated May 1974, filled out in block capitals in a handwriting she had been reading for 27 years. Emmett Rusk had applied for a school bus operator's endorsement in 1974. The district had been short of drivers, and they'd asked around, and he had gone down to the sheriff's office in Marlow and rolled his fingers on a card. He never drove a bus. There's a note in an old board minute about it. The endorsement lapsed. They hired somebody else. But the card existed. 10 black, perfect, deliberate prints, rolled by a deputy in 1974, sitting in the bottom of a locker in a basement for 41 years. Ruth Ann didn't know what it meant. She wants that understood too. She was not a detective. She had never filed a public records request in her life. She had a bad knee and a demolition deadline, and 11 more rooms to go. But she sat on that floor for a very long time, with a fingerprint card in her hand. And one sentence kept turning over. He left the wrench. He left his license. He left his union card. Nobody leaves their union card. Ruth Ann Doss did not go to the police. Not at first. She had nothing to go with. A woman walks into the sheriff's office in Marlow with a pair of boots and a story about a man who moved to Kentucky in 1988. And she knows exactly how that conversation goes. So she did the thing she actually knew how to do. She went and looked at the paperwork of a school district. 27 years in a building teaches you where the paper lives. Ruth Ann knew that the district had never thrown anything away, because she was the one who had been moving the boxes since 1989. She knew the surplus requisition ledgers for 1974 through 1998 were in 9 cardboard boxes on a shelf in the basement of the administration annex, because she had carried them there herself in 2001 when they redid the floor. She spent 4 evenings with those ledgers, in a folding chair with a flashlight, in a room that smelled like mouse. The district issued its custodial staff 1 pair of work boots per year, every August, ordered through a supply house in Terre Haute. Every order was logged. Name, size, cost, date. And what Ruth Ann Doss found in those ledgers made her put the flashlight down. August 1978, Rusk E. 10.5, Prather L. 12. August 1979, Rusk E. 10.5, Prather L. 12. August 1980 through August 1988. The same. Every year. 2 names, 2 sizes. 10.5 and 12. August 1989. Prather L. 12. Doss R. 7. And underneath, Rusk E. 12. Ruth Ann read that line 4 times. August 1990. Rusk E. 12. August 1991. Rusk E. 12. Every year through August 1997. Rusk E. Size 12. For 9 years, Marlow Consolidated School District had ordered a pair of size 12 boots for a man who wore a 10.5. Somebody had filled out that form 9 times. Somebody had signed for those boots 9 times. Somebody had worn them until the outer edge of the right heel wore through, and then put them in a locker that wasn't his, and locked it with his own padlock and kept the key. She thought about Lyle Prather saying, "Leave it, he'll want his things." She thought about a man who talked constantly and never said Emmett Rusk's name again. Something felt wrong, really wrong. And now, for the first time in 27 years, she could point at exactly where. She kept going. She pulled the payroll ledgers. Employee number 0411. Rusk, Emmett J., night custodian. Hired September 1971. Continuous, uninterrupted. Paid every 2 weeks, without a single break through November 14th, 1997. When the line was closed out with the notation, "Position consolidated." 26 years of employment, on paper, for a man who last swept a floor in October 1988. And on the back of the ledger sheets, taped in, a stack of garnishment orders. Not for Emmett Rusk, for Lyle Prather. 3 of them, 1985, 1987, 1988. A judgment from a finance company in Evansville. Wages attachable at 25%. Ruth Ann sat back in her folding chair in the dark and understood that she was looking at something and had no idea what to do with it, and was absolutely certain about one single thing. Emmett Rusk had never gone to Kentucky. Here is where this case becomes something other than a mystery. Because Ruth Ann Doss now believed a man had gone missing in 1988. And she discovered over the following 6 weeks that believing it was not enough. That in the machinery of the state, belief has no handle on it. She went to the Marlow town marshal first. A polite young man named Deputy Aaron Falk heard her out for 20 minutes and asked the obvious question. "Who's reporting him missing?" "I am," Ruth Ann said. "What's your relationship to Mr. Rusk?" And Ruth Ann Doss opened her mouth and could not answer it. She had never met him. She was not his wife, his sister, his daughter, his cousin, his employer, his executor, or his friend. She had never spoken to him, seen him, or heard his voice. She was the woman who used his wrench. Falk was not unkind. He explained it as gently as he could. A missing person report from 1988 is a 1988 problem. There's no report on file. There's no family requesting one. The subject would be 68 years old and legally entitled to be wherever he wanted. And a woman with no relationship to him, reporting him missing 27 years after the fact, based on a boot order. There was no form for that. There was literally no box on the screen. "I'm not saying you're wrong, ma'am," he told her. "I'm saying I don't have a door for this." She went to the district superintendent, who was appalled, and then cautious, and then referred it to the district's attorney, who advised that the district should not make public statements about a decades-old payroll irregularity potentially involving a retired employee, pending review. She went to the state police post in Sellersburg and spent an afternoon in a waiting room, and was told, politely, to file with the local agency of jurisdiction. She went back to the local agency of jurisdiction. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of a 62-year-old woman on her own time, driving her own car, making her case to people who all agreed she seemed sincere. And the whole time, the building was coming down around her. That was the other clock. She had 11 rooms left in July, and 7 in August, and 3 in September. And the contractor's abatement crew was scheduled for January. And after that, nobody would be allowed in the building at all. And in May, there would not be a building. Everything she had was inside it. What broke it open, in the end, was a librarian. Her name was Delphine Okoro, and she ran the local history room at the Marlow Public Library. And she was the only person in 6 weeks who did not ask Ruth Ann what her relationship to the deceased was. She asked a different question. She said, "Do you have prints?" Ruth Ann said, "I have a fingerprint card from 1974. And Delphine Okoro sat back in her chair and said, "Then you don't need a missing person report. You need a coroner." This is the moment the entire case turns over, and it is worth slowing down for. For 6 weeks, Ruth Ann Doss had been trying to report a man missing. Delphine Okoro pointed out that the state of Indiana maintains a database of unidentified human remains. That there are at any given time several hundred people in this country who have been found, examined, autopsied, photographed, and buried by public employees who did everything right and simply never learned their names. Missing persons and unidentified decedents are 2 ends of the same problem. And one of them does not require a family to open the door. You do not need standing to identify a body. You need prints. Ruth Ann drove to the county coroner's office in Marlow on a Tuesday morning in late September with a manila envelope in a grocery bag on the passenger seat because she was afraid of bending it. The deputy coroner was a woman named Priya Raghunathan, 34, who did the job part-time alongside a funeral home. She looked at a 1974 civil applicant card for a long time and said the sentence that reorganized everything. "These are good prints. These are really good prints. Whoever rolled these knew what they were doing." She explained what would happen. The card would be scanned and submitted to the state repository. It would be searched against criminal and civil files, and against the unidentified decedent file, because when a body comes in unidentified, if the hands are viable, the pathologist takes post-mortem prints, and those prints go into the system, and they sit there forever, waiting. "How long does it take?" Ruth Ann asked. "Depends," Priya said. "Days, sometimes weeks." It took 9 days. Ruth Ann was in the second-floor east hallway, taking a bulletin board off a wall, when her phone rang at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon. Priya Raghunathan's voice was strange, flat and fast at the same time. "Mrs. Doss, I need you to sit down." Ruth Ann sat down on an overturned milk crate in an empty hallway of a condemned school. "We got a hit," Priya said. "It's a 10-point match. It's not close, it's not probable, it's a match." "To what?" Ruth Ann said. "To a case in Warwick County," Priya said. "Male decedent, recovered March of 1989. He's been in the system since 1989. He's been in the ground since 1989. And then she said the thing that Ruth Ann Doss has never been able to repeat without her voice going. "Ma'am, he was never missing. He was found 26 years ago. Nobody ever came to get him." Roland Pike was 55 years old and 4 years retired and mowing a lawn in Boonville when his old bureau called him. He drove to Marlow the next morning. He was there before 9. He had a photocopied file on the seat beside him that he had been carrying from house to house since 1989. He met Ruth Ann Doss in the parking lot of a school that was being torn down. And the first thing he did, before hello, was ask her to say the name. "Emmett Rusk," she said. "J. Emmett J. Rusk." Pike stood there in the parking lot with his hand over his mouth. 26 years, 17 counties, dental impressions mailed in envelopes, 17 possibles eliminated one by one. He had done all of it correctly, and the answer had never come. And the reason the answer had never come was not a failure of investigation. It was that on the other end of his case, in a limestone building 60 miles north, there was no case at all. There was a man's name on a payroll line and a pair of size 12 boots being worn by somebody else. He had been searching for a name that nobody had noticed was gone. "I want to show you something," he told Ruth Ann. And he opened the file on the hood of his car, and he turned it to the property inventory from March 1989. Item 4, footwear, brown leather work boot, pair, manufacturer marking obscured, size 10.5, wear pattern, outer right heel, through to welt. Ruth Ann put her hand flat on the hood of the car. The boots she had found in that locker were the ones he'd been issued in August 1988. He'd have had them 6 weeks, barely broken in. The ones he was wearing when he died were last year's. The old comfortable ones, because that's what a man wears on a Saturday when he's driving 60 miles to look at a truck. There is one more cruelty in this case, and it comes at the very end, and it nearly ruined everything. They had a name. What they did not have anymore was the man. The paper got sharper and the body got further away. That's the phrase Priya Raghunathan used, and it's exact. Emmett Rusk had been buried in October 1989 in the unclaimed section of the Warwick County Cemetery on Ridge Road, plot marker 89-114. In April 1994, the White River came over its banks and took out the low ground on the east side of that cemetery, including 2/3 of the unclaimed section. 41 graves were disinterred over 6 weeks by a contractor and relocated to higher ground on the north end. The contractor's log survives. It is a mess. It lists 38 sets of remains recovered and 41 graves opened. 3 markers came up with nothing under them, or nothing under them that anyone recorded. In 2003, there was a second relocation. This one, for a highway widening, which moved the north end again and consolidated the flat concrete markers into a single row along a fence, in numerical order, which meant catastrophically that the markers were separated from the plots and reset as a memorial row rather than as headstones. And in the fall of 2015, when Roland Pike went to the Warwick County Cemetery office with a name and a court order, he was told that the highway project was entering its final phase and that the remaining unclaimed remains in the north section, 22 of them, were scheduled for consolidation into a common vault, cremated and interred together, beginning the first week of March 2016. After that, individual identification would be permanently impossible. 5 months, Ruth Ann Doss, who had spent 6 weeks trying to find anyone who would take a report, now watched 3 separate agencies move faster than she had ever seen anything move in her life. Pike, the coroner's office; the county attorney, a state anthropologist out of Indianapolis; They opened the first plot in November. It was not him. They opened the second in December, in the rain, and it was empty, one of the three the 1994 contractor had listed and never accounted for. Ruth Ann stood at that fence line in December with a hood up and her hands in her coat and watched a backhoe take the top off a grave that had nothing in it, and thought about a locker with 2 padlocked pairs of boots in it, and thought, how many times does one man have to disappear? They found him on January 19, 2016. Third plot. 6 feet down under 18 inches of clay fill from 2 separate relocations. A steel county container corroded through on one side. Adult male, complete, with 3 impact fractures to the occipital. The anthropologist confirmed him in 4 days by dentition against Pike's 1989 impressions, which he had mailed to 9 counties in 1989 and which had come back to him 9 times and which he had kept. Emmett J. Rusk, born September 3, 1947, in Cullman County, Alabama, died on or about October 22, 1988, on a gravel pull-off on State Road 9. He had been 11 weeks short of being under that ground, longer than he had been above it. Lyle Prather was 84 years old and living in a care facility in Vincennes. Roland Pike, an state police detective, sat with him in a sunroom on a Tuesday in February 2016. Ruth Ann did not go. She was asked if she wanted to. She said no. She said she'd worked next to him for 8 years, and she didn't want to be a thing that happened to him. He did not deny anything. That surprised everybody. He asked one question first, and it was this: "Did you find him?" They told him yes. And Lyle Prather, 84, put both hands over his face and cried for a long time. In a sunroom. Here is what he said once he could. He had not known. That is the part people find hardest to believe, and the part the evidence supports completely. On Monday, October 24, 1988, Lyle Prather had no idea where Emmett Rusk was. He had not called. There had been no phone call. Lyle invented the phone call standing in a hallway because Harold Beek asked him a question, and he did not have an answer, and he was frightened. Frightened of what? In the summer of 1988, the district had adopted a new hiring and retention policy requiring criminal background checks for all employees with student contact to be phased in at reappointment. Lyle Prather had a 1961 conviction. Burglary in Kentucky at 19 years old. 90 days and probation. He had never disclosed it. Not in 1966 when he was hired. Not ever. He had 3 garnishments against his wages and a wife with emphysema, and he was 58 years old. And he believed, correctly or not, and probably not, that the background check would end him. So when the shift came open, he did not report it. He took it. He worked it under Emmett's number, because Emmett's number was already vetted, already grandfathered, already invisible. 16 hours a day at first, then 8 when Ruth Ann was hired. He signed the checks E. Rusk. He kept the locker locked so nobody would see 2 sizes of everything in it. And he told himself, for 9 years and then for 18 more, the same sentence over and over. The one he said in that sunroom with his hands shaking, "I thought he went somewhere." He hadn't looked. He had never once picked up a phone. He had never driven past a room above a hardware store. He had spent 27 years constructing, in his own mind, a version of Emmett Rusk, who was fine in Brown, who was in Kentucky, who was in Alabama, who was doing all right somewhere because the alternative required him to have done something on Tuesday, October 25, 1988. And he had not done it. "I wasn't hiding him," he said. "There wasn't nothing to hide. I filled the hole in, and then there wasn't a hole." That is the sentence. That is the whole case. I filled the hole in, and then there wasn't a hole. Nobody in the story murdered Emmett Rusk in Marlow. Nobody buried him under a gymnasium floor. There was no predator in the school, no conspiracy in the district office, no secret anybody was keeping. There was one frightened man who told one lie on one Monday morning, and then had to keep the lie fed for 9 years. And the lie's diet was the exact space that a search would have occupied. Dwayne Stiles was arrested on March 8, 2016, at a mobile home outside Dixon, Tennessee. He was 71. He had a scrap hauling business and a granddaughter who did not know about 1989. With a victim identity, Pike's file finally functioned as a file. The truck was Emmett Rusk's, provably VIN partial, a title chain, a service record from a garage on Front Street in Marlow. The timeline closed. Rusk left Marlow on the 22nd. The truck was in Stiles's possession by the 24th, per a witness who had never been findable before because nobody had known what day to ask about. And there was one thing more. In 1989, Roland Pike had impounded that pickup. In 1989, a technician had lifted latent prints from the interior. In 1989, those latents had been compared against Dwayne Stiles and matched, which proved only that he'd driven it, which he admitted. In 2016, they were compared against the 1974 civil applicant card of Emmett J. Rusk. 4 of the latents were his, including 2 on the underside of the steering column, where a man puts his hand when he's fighting a bad clutch. Stiles pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter in November 2016. He was sentenced to 18 years. He allocuted in 4 sentences. He'd asked the man for a ride outside Boonville. He'd wanted the truck. He'd hit him with a bumper jack. And he'd put him in the culvert because it was there. He never said the word sorry, and nobody expected him to. Lyle Prather was charged with theft, forgery, and welfare fraud in a combined state and federal filing. He pleaded guilty in September 2016 to 2 counts. He was 84 and in congestive heart failure, and the state did not seek incarceration. He got a suspended sentence, 4 years of probation he did not live to finish, and a restitution order for $206,000 he could not pay a dollar of. He was not charged with anything relating to Emmett Rusk's death, because he had nothing to do with it. Some people in Marlow thought that was outrageous. Others thought he'd been punished for 28 years already by the only judge that mattered. Ruth Ann Doss did not say publicly what she thought. She said it once, privately, to Delphine Okoro at the library, and Delphine repeated it later with permission. She said, "He didn't kill him. He just made sure nobody ever went looking. I don't know which one of those God cares more about. I really don't." Marlow Consolidated High School came down on schedule in May of 2016. Ruth Ann Doss was there. So were about 200 other people on a Saturday morning, standing behind orange fencing on Cutler Street with coffee, watching an 89-year-old limestone building fold in on itself in 4 seconds. She had emptied it completely. Every room. She had never skipped one. The last things she took out were the tools, the ball-peen hammer with the friction tape, the pipe wrench with the recut jaw, the Folgers can with washers on the side in block capitals, still sorted by size 44 years later. She asked the district if she could keep them. The district said they weren't sure who they belonged to. Ruth Ann said she was pretty sure she knew. Emmett Rusk was reburied on June 4, 2016, in the Marlow Town Cemetery, on a rise near the north fence where you can see the water tower. There was no family. There has never been any family. The genealogist the county used found a half-sister who died in 1981, and nobody after that. 31 people came. Roland Pike came in a suit and stood in the back and did not speak. and left before the reception. Priya Raghunathan came. Delphine Okoro came. Mrs. Ivers, who was 91 and had to be helped from the car, came and told anyone who'd stand still about a man who apologized for fixing her piano. 9 former students came, all of them in their 40s and 50s now, all of them with some version of the same story about rain and a green pickup and a coffee can of quarters by the payphone. 2 custodians came from the new campus who had never met him, in uniform, because Ruth Ann asked them to. The stone is small and flat and gray. It has his name and both dates. And one line underneath that Ruth Ann paid for and chose. The auditorium clock is in the lobby of the new high school now, in a glass case, with a card beside it. It doesn't work. There was no way to move it without breaking the escapement. And the escapement was a spring a man, cut by hand, in 1984, out of stock he had lying around. And there is no replacement for it anywhere in the world. Down in Warwick County, the county replaced one flat 4x8 concrete marker in the memorial row along the fence. They took out the one stamped 89-114 and put in a new one with a name on it, even though the man it belonged to had been moved north. Somebody at the county said it seemed wrong to leave a number sitting there once you knew better. Most missing person stories are stories about searching. Someone looks for years. Someone knocks on doors, keeps a bedroom untouched, calls a detective every anniversary for 3 decades until the detective knows their voice. This one isn't that. This one is about the fact that nobody looked at all. Emmett Rusk was not hidden. He was not buried in a wall or sunk in a quarry or driven across a state line by someone clever. He was found 4 months after he died by a county work crew in daylight. And he was examined and photographed and autopsied and prayed over and buried by public employees who did their jobs properly and gave him the only thing they had left to give him, which was a number. He stayed a number for 27 years for one reason, because being missed is not something that happens automatically when you go. It's a service. Somebody has to be standing in a position to notice, and somebody has to decide that noticing obligates them. And if nobody is standing there, if you have no wife, no children, no siblings, no phone, no bank, and one job that somebody else quietly kept doing, then you can be gone for a very long time without a single hole opening anywhere in the world. That is the hard thing this case leaves you holding. Not that a man was killed for a truck. Men have been killed for less and will be again. It's that the machinery of the world will only come looking for you if you were the kind of person somebody was already positioned to miss. But there's the other half, and it's the half worth taking with you. Nobody assigned Ruth Ann Doss to this. She had no claim on him. She was not his blood, not his friend, not his widow. She had never heard his voice. She was a woman who had used a dead man's wrench for 27 years and had never quite stopped thinking that he wouldn't have left it. She had no standing. She built the standing herself, out of a boot order and a fingerprint card and 6 weeks of being told no by polite people. The obligation nobody picked up in 1988 turned out to be lying there the whole time, waiting. And it turned out anyone could pick it up. Any stranger, at any point, 27 years late. So no, in this story, love didn't do it. There wasn't any love available. There was nobody left alive who had ever loved Emmett Rusk. What proved stronger than the darkness was something quieter and stranger and, in the end, maybe more useful to the rest of us. Somebody who owed him nothing decided he was hers to look for, and that, it turns out, was enough.